Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Huw Marshall. On the programme this week, we are delighted to be joined by the former Motherwell and Wishaw MP, Marion Fellows, who continues to campaign for postmasters wrongly accused in the Post Office Horizon IT scandal. Good afternoon, Marion. How are things in sunny Scotland?
In sunny Wishaw, it's a lovely day, and yes, it's going to stay that way apparently till tomorrow, where we might get some rain. So there you go, back to normal.
Excellent. And we're also delighted to welcome writer and activist William Duguid. Good afternoon, William. I'm not sure if we're hearing you properly, but we'll see now. Yeah, so we got some sound issues with William at the moment, so we will crack on. So to start with, we'll begin with the Ukraine update. North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, has reaffirmed his full support for Moscow in the war in Ukraine during talks with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, state media reported on Sunday. Lavrov is on a 3-day visit to North Korea, the latest in a series of trips by top Moscow officials as the two countries deepen military and political ties. Lavrov also warned the US, South Korea and Japan against forming a security partnership targeting North Korea, accusing the countries of what he called military buildups around North Korea. The deepening relationship between Russia and North Korea has raised concerns among South Korea and the US that Russia might also transfer to North Korea sensitive technologies that can increase the danger of its nuclear and missile programs. Russia fired hundreds of drones and long-range missiles across Ukraine overnight, killing at least 6 people in its latest wave of strikes, Ukraine said on Saturday. Moscow has stepped up aerial strikes over recent months as US-led ceasefire talks have stalled. 26 cruise missiles and 597 attack drones were launched, of which more than half were Shaheeds, President Zelensky said, referring to the Iranian-made drones. The Ukrainian Air Force said it had downed 319 Shahed drones and 25 missiles, adding that 1 missile and about 20 drones had hit 5 locations. Zelensky said the strikes had killed at least 2 people and wounded 20 in the southwestern Chernivtsi region, far from the front lines of the east and south. 12 people were wounded in Lviv, also in the west, while in the east, 2 people died in Dnipropetrovsk and 3 were wounded in Kharkiv, officials said. Zelensky said that some of the drones sent by Russia had been simulators intended to overload the air defense system and make it more difficult to shoot down the suicide drones. In a video message, President Zelensky said, "We are close to reaching a multi-level agreement on new Patriot systems and missiles for them. Ukraine was stepping up production of its own interceptor systems," he added. The US Special Envoy Keith Kellogg is due to begin his latest visit to Ukraine on Monday as Washington-led peace effort flounders. Donald Trump also said he would make a major statement on Russia on Monday. On Friday, the Kremlin restated its opposition to a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine after French President Emmanuel Macron said Kyiv's allies had a plan ready to go in the hours after a ceasefire. Zelensky urged Western allies to send more than just signals to stop the war, launched by Russia in February 2022. The pace of Russian airstrikes requires swift decisions, and it can be curbed right now through sanctions, he said on social media. Zelensky specifically demanded penalties for those who help Russia produce drones and profit from oil. So, yes, it's quite a depressing picture there from Marion. What's your feelings now on Ukraine?
I mean, Trump seems to blow hot and cold on support, and the latest view is that he's going to give them more support, which is desperately needed, because at the end of the day, this is a war in Europe, and it has to be brought to a successful conclusion, and we have to have peace in Europe. It's absolutely appalling the way Trump has behaved in the past, because let's face it, NATO is American-backed, and there are real difficulties within NATO in getting Trump to help the Europeans who want to police a ceasefire. And the ceasefire and the talks with Putin and that seem to have just vanished completely.
What did you make of Trump's comments this week? It's the first time that he's actually been critical of Putin.
I mean, that's this week. I mean, very cynically, that's what he's saying this week. But if Putin says something nice about him next week, that might all change. And that's the real situation that we're all living in. Appalling though it may sound.
It is. Okay, so we move on to the Middle East update. At least 57,882 Palestinians have been killed and 138,095 wounded in Gaza since 7th of October 2023. With critical fuel shortages, over 800 killed in food queues and Israeli airstrikes continuing, why is the UK government still selling arms to Israel? That's an interesting question, Marion. What's your take on the situation in Gaza? It seems to be worsening.
It is. It's worsening. It's even more appalling than it was when the war started, because it is a war. It's a war on Palestinian civilians mainly. It's absolutely appalling that our government, our UK government, is still selling arms to Israel. Why? Well, I think that perhaps the cynic in me says because many, many people in the Labour Party and government are receiving funding from Israel and Israel supporting organisations. And that's the kind of thing that we really need to clean up in our politics. Things were bad enough before Labour got into government, when they had to be pushed, shoved and made to say that they wanted a ceasefire, because right at the start they were 100% behind Israel, saying that they had every right to defend themselves, which no one calling for a ceasefire ever put in doubt. Of course Israel has the right to defend itself as any other sovereign nation has, but you don't defend yourself by killing innocent women and children against international law.
Yeah, and we have to remember Starmer stating that he was happy that Israel were cutting off water to Palestinians at the beginning of the war. William, are you able to hear us, and can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can. Well done, excellent, William. It's good to have you join us. Did you hear what we were talking about there with the Palestinians and the Middle East? Is there anything you'd like to add?
I probably don't have anything particularly to add to what Marion was saying, because it sounded fairly eloquent and summing up what it's all about right now. I mean, it's a disgraceful situation which the world still seems to be doing very little to push back against, and it's just a common theme in the treatment of minority people and the dehumanization that goes on. We'll be touching on that maybe a wee bit later with regard to some historical stuff. So no, I currently despair. I just wish and hope that something will happen to improve things at some undisclosed time. But for now, yeah, it's just protest unrelentingly, I think, and just make sure the government's hearing what we're saying about it.
And this week, of course, Netanyahu visited the White House and left without any ceasefire being agreed. And we also saw the farcical situation of him telling Trump that he was going to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize, which is slightly ironic when you think that Netanyahu is facing charges of war crimes as well currently. Anyway, on to the Post Office inquiry. So the Post Office Horizon IT Inquiry, Volume 1 report from Sir Wyn Williams, the inquiry chair, looks at the disastrous human impact on thousands of post office operators, including up to 13 suicides. Marion, I know this is an area that obviously you've been very active in. Have you had a chance to read through Sir Wyn's initial findings?
I've read through most of it. I was actually there at the inquiry launch, the launch of the Chapter 1 report, and I have to tell you, the atmosphere in the room was the strangest atmosphere I've ever been in. Relief that the human impact stuff has finally gone out, and I think it was very shrewd and understanding of Sir Wyn to do that first, because rather than wait, and it'll now be next year before the full report is published. Some of his recommendations are really interesting and really back up the feelings of postmasters in general and folk who work for Crown Post Offices, folk who actually worked for Post Office. It's really hard to describe the effect on people. I've been working very closely with Rab Thompson, who's one of the cases that Sir Wyn used to illustrate his report and the recommendations. When you listen to Rab, and I've heard him talk about his difficulties in the past at various venues, and one where it was to Scottish Government officials who were working on trying to find postmasters in Scotland so that they could be exonerated, so that they could then become eligible for redress. And those civil servants heard Rab, and I'm sure they worked 4 times harder simply because of the awful story he had to tell about what happened to him. Government has already said they'll accept 2 of his recommendations, and that's ones where they're going to accept the recommendation that claimants should be able to bank the best offer, because at the moment that's not happening. If you apply for redress and you get a forensic accountant in and put in a claim that isn't the fixed sum that's on offer for a scheme, then you risk losing the fixed offer. So if you're entitled to £600,000, but you think you should go for more, then you risk of getting less than £600,000 at the moment, which is ridiculous. The government have also said that they will look at providing redress for families of sub-postmasters, and especially those who have died. It's just, and the interesting thing is, Sir Wyn's put a deadline for responses to his recommendation of the 7th of October, so that he can come back and chastise government, Post Office and Fujitsu if they don't come good by telling him what they're going to do in response to his recommendations by that date. He's a wily old bird, this Sir Wyn.
I think that's one of the good things come out of it. Sir Wyn has done an excellent job, I think, of showing what an inquiry can and should do. It beggars belief that claims closed with the death of an individual and that families weren't eligible for that. But it's just a catalogue of disastrous errors. Yeah. William, what was your take on the announcement this week?
Well, it was hardly surprising, but it was sobering to hear not just how many of the affected postmasters were recorded as having committed suicide, but how many actually considered it. I mean, there must have been another, was it 58 or 59 in all that considered it as a result of what they were being put through, because it was an absolute suite of torture, not just resistance, but also how they were, in many cases, treated by their local communities while all this was going on, and it's marriages breaking up, it's unjustified prison sentences and all that stems from that, and it's just the whole process of putting your life back together again, and constantly meeting with pushback from the Post Office, which should have got a bit of humility a long time ago. And I recognise that this is only the first thing to really truly come out of the inquiry, and there will be more. And I hope certainly that there's more about the repercussions for the post office and Fujitsu people who've been so instrumental when they knew there was a problem, so instrumental in continuing this torture. It's not at all unusual for inquiries to take a long time and for justice to be delayed, but I hope in the end it isn't denied, and that there is some sort of closure for the families of those who've died, but also for those who remain alive and are trying to rebuild their lives. So an interesting week, but certainly a lot more to come.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite sobering to think that, this action was sort of the catalyst for it was the Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, the ITV dramatisation of that with Alan Bates, who was a sub postmaster in Llandudno in North Wales. But this week, it was announced that following, I think, an FOI, that Fujitsu have been awarded £500 million in additional contracts since this had come out. Marion, what do you think of that?
Well, that's just absolutely awful. And no sane person would believe that that could possibly happen. But unfortunately, it's just another way that this whole Horizon scandal is going. Just when you think that could never happen, it does. It's been absolutely. You mentioned Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. I can remember being told in, I think, October that it was going to be broadcast on New Year's Day, and I remember thinking, well, who's going to be watching? And so it was amazing, and the fact that it prompted government and the opposition, in fact, into moving things forward is testament to the programme itself. But it should never have been that moved this forward. People knew about Horizon, they knew about the issues way before Mr. Bates versus the Post Office was made and then broadcast. It's an appalling, absolutely appalling scandal that hits government ministers of all parties. It hits Post Office Limited and folk like Paula Venables, who knew what was happening and were lying about it in Parliament to parliamentary committees. And actually, someone on Tuesday in the House of Commons called for them. It was Liam Byrne, who's chair of the Business and Trade Committee, who said perhaps it's time to invoke parliamentary procedures and haul these people in front of Parliament to get them to talk about what happened and to show what's happening. I mean, the thing that strikes me as well is the Met Police have been investigating this since Fujitsu employees spoke to the inquiry, 1.5 years ago? And nothing has moved forward, and they're talking about it being 2028 before any possible arrests are going to be made. This is why, I'm sorry, that you can understand I get really passionate about this, but this is why a number of us set up an organisation called Scottish Postmasters for Justice and Redress, because Scottish postmasters feel even more distance from what's going on. Alan Bates hasn't yet received his recompense, and that's astonishing, astounding if it wasn't Post Office involved in all of this. It really is important that anyone who is a postmaster who suffered from Horizon, especially if they're going to claim on the historic shortfall scheme, actually get their applications in by the end of November this year, because then that scheme will close. And we really need to help these people get some redress. It won't solve their problems, but it will give them something to hang on to and to look at going forward.
William, are you surprised at the sort of lack of pace in looking at prosecuting people from the Post Office and Fujitsu who clearly knew that, people were being prosecuted and potentially taking their own lives based on false evidence? It was quite remarkable that they were quite quick to prosecute those people, and yet those people who are potentially facing prosecution, as Marion just said, looking, 3 years down the line. What's your view on that?
Well, I would like to say I was surprised, but I'm not particularly, because it's the way the British establishment deals with scandals, there's one set of people always who are protected, and there's another who are going to be the victims, and that's always the case. It's absolutely absurd that it's going to take so long for any question of prosecutions to come up. I mean, we're looking at what? We're looking at perjury, we're looking at perversion of the course of justice. We may even be looking at corporate manslaughter in some cases. And that needs to be, justice delayed is justice denied in the end, even if I said I hoped it wouldn't be. Because already several victims have not lived to see any movement whatsoever, not just in terms of prosecutions, but in terms of being recognized as being victims rather than perpetrators. Some people went to their graves with a stain over their characters. And it's a horrific injustice, but it's fairly typical. If you look back to other inquiries that have taken forever, the infected blood scandal is one, Hillsborough is another. There are many, many more. This is the speed at which the British establishment moves, and it needs to be different. I don't know how we make it different, because it'll require a government that actually has the political will to do something about it, and to change the whole culture, because it's a culture change that we need. If we have effectively an establishment class and a poor victims class, and one gets no justice at all and the other never has to pay any recompense, then we're in a hole, and that's the thing we need to sort out completely.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Could I just say,
Sorry, Marion.
can I just say one thing? One of the really interesting recommendations by Sir Wynne is for the government to set up a public body to administer and deliver financial redress schemes, and that taking it away from those. I mean, let's be, Post Office Limited were involved in the redress schemes, which when you look at it, it makes no sense, but it was the quickest way to set things up. So if there was almost a standing agency, it would help with the infected blood. It would have helped with Hillsborough, all of us. It would be totally separate from government. And I think that's really what's needed. So sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's an important recommendation.
I think it's
very interesting to see if the government takes it on.
It's quite relevant to the next conversation. So this week, a new UK left-wing party has been announced. So Azara Sultana launched a fundraising and supporter sign-up page promoting plans for the formation of a new left-wing UK party. The media are already reporting divisions between Sultana, Jeremy Corbyn and the Left Alliance. Can any new party of the left survive the UK media, and how would it fare in the UK first past the post elections? William, I'll come to you first. What was your take on the announcements that Zara Sultana made?
I thought it was quite interesting, and that there may well be room for it if Labour has completely forgotten its roots, which it appears to have done. However, I do think there will be a significant backlash against it in the fairly established right-wing media. That's the general tenor of the media. There'll be some pockets of perhaps support, but even those may be fairly wedded to Labour Party thinking. So I'm not entirely sure that it's going to fly very easily. And certainly in the first past the post system, history will suggest that's a very, very hard thing to crack until you get up to something like 24 or 25%. You're really not going to make much of a difference. And for me, the great historical example was the SDP alliance in 1983, which polled very, very close to what Labour polled in the 1983 election. It was about 700,000 short of overtaking Labour. But it just got 23 seats for its 24% or thereabouts, whereas Labour got 209 for its 26% or thereabouts. And that's the kind of barrier you have to break. And part of the result of that, of course, and I wouldn't wish this to be a reason for not founding a new party, is that I think probably Margaret Thatcher would have won that election anyway, but she would not have had the landslide that she did have if the opposition on the left had not been split. So that's the barrier that the new party reaches with first past the post. More interesting for me, I think, is that we don't know exactly, certainly what their intentions are of having a Scottish chapter and what their intentions might be of having a Welsh chapter for that matter. But with non-first past the post elections coming up in both places next year, they might see that as a way that they can break through and get some basic electoral credibility before they start thinking about the 2029, which they've got at this point a 4-year build-up to. So that has all sorts of possibilities attached to it, and not least the question of what the new party's attitude to independence might be, and there's already been some debate about that. But given that particularly the Scottish people are seem to be looking around for something to vote for that they can vote for, rightly or wrongly, I think it's another very interesting thing in the mix, and we shall have to wait and see what happens.
Yes, indeed.
Marion, because I think it's interesting to remember that Corbyn Mark I, when he stood in the general election campaign, pulled more votes than Starmer did at the last election. So clearly, even though he was facing lots of criticism of the media, he did manage to cut through, especially with younger people, via social media. So I think, when we talk about right-wing press and stuff, is that becoming less relevant? We've seen Reform, basically, they've got their own platform. They just, flood social media with their messages. How do you think, a Corbyn stroke Sultana sort of party would fare?
I think I agree with everything that William said already. I think they may well get the votes from younger people. I know in 2017, I went from a majority of almost 12,000 to a majority of 300 and odd against the Labour candidate here. And that was kind of across Scotland. That was seen to be quite normal. In fact, 312 was quite a high majority for some of my colleagues in that election. It shows that he was able to cut through on social media and all the other beliefs. But the really interesting thing at the moment is the rise of Reform and its appeal to young people, because they seem to have got a grip on social media, on TikTok and all the things that younger folk use. And they, of course, have one thing that any new party like Corbyn and Zara Sultana, Reform has money. They have big business behind them. They have all sorts of people willing to give them thousands and thousands, if not millions of pounds. And that, at the end of the day, all comes, a lot of what you do with a new party or any party comes down to money. And I'm not entirely sure that this new party, which I would be quite happy to see moving forward, will have the donations, the big donors that most parties need to keep themselves afloat across the UK in its entirety.
William, because obviously yesterday, the day before, Unison came out saying that they were considering their links with the UK Labour Party because they felt that the party was no longer working, with the interests of working people in mind. Do you think that the fact that people see Starmer's Labour as edging further right offers an opportunity? Marion talking about funding. Do you think the unions would get behind this new party?
I think it would still take quite a lot for the unions to get behind the new party, because the unions aren't always all that left-wing an influence, or haven't been, on the Labour Party, and loyalties remain loyalties. I think the issue with, I'm not sure if it's Unison or Unite, but you may be right, over Angela Rayner and all that sort of stuff. I think that is largely a strategy to get a settlement in the Birmingham bin dispute. I think it will take quite a lot for unions to shift in large numbers away from the Labour Party, which is the sort of thing you would need to counterbalance what you're getting elsewhere to keep that party down. But it's arguable that just because there hasn't been a sea change in UK politics for quite some time, maybe the time is right for it. But whether it can happen fast enough to make a big change in 2029 is another matter entirely.
Indeed.
Yes. So apologies to Unison there. It is Unite, because Angela Graham, General Secretary of Unite, has been quite vocal. And as you say, William, it could well just be a negotiating tactic. But again, it leads us quite neatly into the next item. By 2029-2030, 750,000 new disabled and universal credit health claimants will be £2,970 poorer as a result of the vote to cut disability benefits. Of the 37 Scottish Labour MPs, only 5 voted against. Earlier this week, senior Labour Party figures told the media that plans to scrap the 2-child cap were dead in the water. As the UK economy shrinks, how many more families will be in poverty? Marion, what was your feeling when you saw the debacle that this has been for the last couple of weeks?
Appalled, I think, would be my best description. I was the disability spokesperson for the SNP Westminster Group from 2020 until 2024, and I saw firsthand the effect that disability has on families, has on livelihoods, has on just generally people's lives. And the idea that a Labour government was going to cut those benefits was absolutely abhorrent. And they were, especially PIP, the personal independence payment in Scotland, it's the adult disability payment, is much, much more difficult to get than any other benefit. Between the assessments and all that goes on. And now that anyone in Scotland who is applying will now apply for the Scottish Social Security System benefit, doesn't actually mean that Scotland is immune from these cuts. It means that we'll get less money from the UK government as part of this, the annual settlement. And it's been really strange to watch our Labour government take on Tory policies, because they were going to do something similar, and actually do it with even more gusto and verve. I think it just shows what a bad politician Starmer is. He gets an idea in his head and he doesn't take people with him. And in this case, thank God he didn't take people with him. But personal independence payment allows people who have a disability to pay the additional costs of working, getting to work, perhaps, getting special adaptations, which don't happen fast enough with the system that's set up. The whole thing was a disaster from start to finish, and I'm very glad that it isn't going forward in the way that they've suggested.
William, when you think about again, we were talking earlier about the shift, a new left-wing party, and this is one of the issues I think that has pushed some of those over the edge, so to speak. Do you think that it is strange that a Labour Party is so focused on basically sort of taking money from people with disabilities? And not willing to tax, the super rich and the corporations. What do you think the optics of that are with the public?
The optics are appalling. If you were to poll the public, I'm pretty sure you would get a majority in favour of greater taxes on the wealth of people and on the wealthy. The sort of direction of travel has been a redistribution of wealth for about the last 40 years in favour of the more wealthy and against those with less money. And the result of that is that the economy suffers because too many people just don't have enough money to spend in the economy to make it really prosperous. And you get little pockets of absolute prosperity, and then you get you get deserts. I think the optics are awful, but also very strange. I don't understand why a Labour Party with a massive majority, which it picked up a year ago just, wasn't able to capitalise on that to do something radical that people would actually support. One possibility is that they're feared about what the social media and the press will do to them if they attempt that. But I would be prepared to brazen that out with 5 years to go and a majority that size. I really would. Now, although they do have the majority, they have quite a lot of very, very disaffected MPs. They're staying in the party at the moment. They haven't right now gone over to the new party that Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn are forming. That could change. Their whole attitude to a lot of them MPs for the first time, remember, their whole attitude to how things are being done and should be done in Westminster has changed, and Labour has effectively lost any control it might have had over them, and that's going to make for a very interesting few years to come. So it's bad politics, bad optics, bad just about everything, and I don't really understand why fiscal rules, which actually seem to be quite capable of being bent when it's defence spending that's required, why the fiscal rules can't actually be reshaped to be a bit more in favour of people rather than in favour of systems.
Marion, it must be really frustrating for yourself. Do you have a feeling in Scotland that people who switched from Labour, from the SNP to Labour with the general election, with the promises of change, are they suffering from buyer's remorse now?
Well, I couldn't give you a definitive answer on that, but yes, I think so. I think, generally speaking, and especially in the Central Belt, the new Labour MPs seem to have be joined at the hip with Starmer and his policies, which are not things that, generally speaking, most people in Scotland would agree with. I mean, the two-child benefit cap, the removal of that, the fact that they saved a refinery in England but not at Grangemouth, the fact that they've gone after people with disabilities, I think that's anathema to most people, and most of them haven't even opened local offices or have local phone numbers in the Central Belt, which is absolutely mind-blowing.
Because there are similarities here in Wales, where you have, obviously we've had a Labour government for the last 25 years in the Senedd in Cardiff Bay, but the relationship between the Welsh Labour group there and the Welsh MPs are very, very different, and I think it is causing rifts within the party. William, do you see this, having an impact on Labour in Scotland?
I think it possibly could. Labour in Scotland demonstrated themselves in Hamilton to be fairly resilient, although I do think there were local factors in that may have come into play. I think, though, Labour are struggling a wee bit in Scotland at the minute, and we're actually getting into a position with 2026 round the corner where it's no parties can be absolutely confident about how things will go, and as a result, there's still everything to play for, and it may lead to quite an interesting and challenging campaign that's probably going to start not just in the 6 weeks before the election, but should be really getting going over the autumn with the party conferences and things. I think Labour have still got a lot they could lose in Scotland, particularly if a new party suddenly comes into the mix. That is a possibility. The Tories aren't looking like anything great. Reform, it may think it's on the up, but I actually think that there isn't the level of support right now in Scotland for that there is in England, but they will come into play very much on the list. And the SNP, well, as I said, everything to play for. I do think maybe the SNP needs to refocus itself fairly sharply, fairly soon, in order to take advantage of that. But the opportunity is there, everything to play for.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting from a Welsh perspective. It's it looks like a three-way race between Plaid Cymru, Labour, and Reform. With recent polling showing the Plaid Cymru and Reform ahead of Labour. I think the only thing that's a sort of a certainty at the moment is the Conservative vote appears to have collapsed and just gone almost wholesale over to Reform. But no, it is interesting times ahead. Finally, to begin this discussion, we have a video that Marsh Mira 2025, or March for Peace, arriving at Potokari. The Marsh Mira is an annual peace walk in Bosnia and Herzegovina, organised in memory of the victims of the 1995 Srebrenica Genocide. Over 6,000 people from Bosnia and around the world joined the march this year. The Marsh Mira from Nezug to Potokari retraces the 100-kilometre march through the forests of eastern Bosnia that were taken by Bosniak men and boys during the war to escape the genocide and reach safety in Bosnian army-controlled territory. quite sobering watching that, and I think it's worth reminding that there's many people who be watching probably don't remember what happened, even though it was 30 years ago. At least 8,372 men and young boys were murdered under just awful situation. All men under 65 and I think all boys over 13 were basically rounded up and executed. And it's the biggest genocide since the Second World War, and it was quite interesting to see many of those in the parade carrying Palestinian flags and wearing the colours of Palestine, because it's a reminder of what's actually happening now. William, we all three of us are of an age where we actually remember the war and what was happening, and we see what's happening in Ukraine now, and for me it's surprising that it's still happening today. What do you think?
Again, I wish I could say it was surprising, but I'm afraid the capacity of the world to learn from past events is extremely limited. And a lot of people have forgotten Srebrenica. And you know that when you see what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Gaza, and the way that the perpetrators either get a free pass or don't get dealt with in any realistic way that's going to stop the carnage. And I think I haven't seen enough of the Srebrenica remembrance in the mainstream media. Maybe they've been occupied with other things, and I think it's a great thing that Broadcasting Scotland have shown this film, because it does remind us that the human race can be absolutely horrendous to itself, and the organizations we hope will protect us, and in the case of Srebrenica, it was the UN, cannot always just be relied on to do their duty. That was one of the main failings. And I think it's important that we keep remembering, and that we keep reminding people, not just at the 30th, but at every anniversary of this sort of thing, particularly in the light of the fact that this still goes on, that this is a part of human life right now that, as a species, as people populating the planet, we need to put a stop to this and make sure it doesn't happen again, and find a way of living together in peace and harmony. So yeah, a very, very moving film to watch that.
Marion, I think
Yeah.
I was taken by the fact that that as William was saying, it's 30-year anniversary of a a hugely historic moment. I haven't seen anything or heard anything in the media this week, and especially in light, as William mentioned, what's happening in Ukraine and Gaza at the moment. I found that bizarre. Have you seen any coverage?
No, and I think that's. I mean, lots of people. I mean, I wasn't even tremendously aware of Srebrenica, and working, living in Scotland, bringing up a family, all of that. It didn't really make a huge impact on me, but interestingly enough, since I became an MP, I've met various people, learned an awful lot more. Actually met someone on holiday last year who'd worked as a nurse in the area during all of this, and also got involved a bit with the work of the Holocaust Memorial Trust, which is not just about the Holocaust. They've done work in Rwanda, they've done work all over the world to try and stop this happening, but further genocides, and it would be difficult to say that they've had a huge success in trying to get that message across. At least people are aware of the Holocaust. People are not aware of Srebrenica. They don't know a huge amount about Rwanda, what's going on in Ukraine, and what's going on in Gaza. They're finding out on a daily basis. But as newspapers switch to the next headline, the war in Palestine is becoming more and more distanced in the media. Now, there are still things happening, children being killed going for food, but there seems to be no real pressure on governments to make that change. And I don't know where, because it's man's inhumanity to man seems to be almost inbred. And watching that video was really, really moving. Really moving. And to see the number of children that were taking part I thought that was really interesting and useful, because the problem is we need to educate each generation about what's happened in the hope that they will understand and do their best to change the way that we conduct our business abroad in different countries, all countries, because we all have a part to play in this, all of us.
William, just thinking back, because obviously one of the reasons that allowed this to happen at the time was the United Nations refused to give the Danish peacekeepers permission to use force to protect the people. For me, I don't know if you agree, growing up, the UN was a powerful body that had impact, and I think that was almost like the starting point of the United Nations losing its grip on being able to be sort of keeping world peace. And I was just going to say, I was just going to add Yemen to the list as well. There's the atrocities that are going on there as well. And like I say, it's happening all over the world. And have we become numb, immune to what's happening, William?
I don't think ordinary people have become numb to it. I think governments seem to have become numb to it. And the ordinary people don't seem to be able to do anything to influence the governments. I think you will see the numbers of people who will come out to marches in support of doing something to stop the Gaza genocide, for example. And yet that activity, particularly if it attaches itself to certain organizations, is now becoming potentially criminal or can be criminalized. And that's what governments are doing about it. But the people are finding ways of coming out to protest about it. And long may that continue, because that's the thing that gives me hope. What we need to change actually is just the attitudes of the governments in the world, and maybe that will be a start. I think we've probably still got all the faults that we always had, but I do have faith in ordinary people if they come out in sufficient numbers, and that's the important thing. And if they aren't discouraged by the attitude of the ruling classes, then maybe at some point we'll get to the point where we can coexist on the planet without any of the strife. But maybe I'll be long gone by then, but it'll be worth it when it comes, maybe.
Hopefully you'll be around for a few years to come, William.
Yeah.
Marion, I was just going to ask you, when you think about what was happening, obviously the anniversary this week, and it, almost perverse that a group that is protesting against sort of what's happening in Palestine have been prescribed as a terrorist organisation, whilst it's come out in the media that we're still supplying parts for aircraft in the Israeli army and still involved in training. Do you find it strange, the shift of blame, especially with what's going on and in this week?
Yes, I mean, I think it's beyond sad. It sometimes just fills me with dread. I mean, if you're prescribing an organisation that's advocating peace, more or less, in Palestine and calling out genocide, then the government is a long way short of where it is in relation to what people in the UK want. I was reflecting when William was speaking. I mean, I marched, many hundreds of thousands of people marched against the Iraq war. And I think that's the last, perhaps I'm wrong, but the last huge UK-wide demonstration by members of the public which was totally ignored by the Labour government then. And there may well be, I mean, they're sorry afterwards that they didn't find weapons of mass destruction. Yes, but no one believed, or many people did not believe that was the case. And I think there's a certain resignation now that it doesn't matter what you do, the government will do what it wants. And that we have to break down that barrier. Whether it's the rise of social media, there are fewer and fewer, since the Greta Thunberg Friday strikes in schools and the demonstrations, there seems to be less and less, or fewer and fewer younger people getting involved. And the generation that, I mean, the 60s went out and, protested in the 60s is dying off. So I don't know how we solve this, but there's a real feeling of, what does it matter? What can we do? And we need more 82-year-old English vicars that are prepared to do stuff like that to actually get people moving again, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that's it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who's donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist without your support. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests, Marion and William. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.